Okay, this is the first section of our lecture on the endocrine system. So we'll be taking a look at hormones and paracrine substances and how communication takes place inside the body from a chemical standpoint as opposed to an electrical standpoint like we saw in the previous chapter with the nervous system. So the first little bit that we're going to talk about here is on cell-to-cell communication. And previously we covered, what was it, back in chapter 3, we covered different cell-to-cell connections. We talked about gap junctions. So when you can have cells that are very close to each other and actually have little passageways through their cell membranes from one cell to the next, then information or substances can travel relatively quickly from one cell to the next. Cardiac muscle cells, for example, have gap junctions. We called those intercalated discs a couple chapters ago to allow cardiac muscle cells to contract more or less sequentially, and so from there the heart can contract as a single functional unit. The other option, if you don't have the capacity for cell-to-cell direct connection, is to have some sort of chemical messenger that's released into the bloodstream, travels in the blood, and eventually links up with some target cells that have the right receptors for whatever that substance might be. So for molecules that, or for cells that have receptors for that molecule, they would then be able to receive the message and respond accordingly. Any cells that don't have the proper receptor would therefore ignore the message and not respond at all to it. So it's all about having the right receptor if you're dealing with hormones. Another type of chemical messenger that we'll talk about in addition to hormones is called a paracrine substance. These are things that substances that one organ or one tissue might release that might have an effect pretty much right next door to where it was released. These things do not typically travel in the blood. They're typically relatively short distance communication, although not as short as like a gap junction, obviously. We're dealing with longer distances than that, but usually not as far as what you deal with a typical hormone type situation. Now, another term that sometimes is a bit confusing is the term pheromone. And pheromones are things that are not the same as hormones. These are things that are released from one organism that will then elicit some sort of response from another organism. So this is like individual to individual communication. You might have mating pheromones, you might have attack pheromones, you might have trail following pheromones, for example. All of these things are chemicals produced by one organism that will then cause some other organism to respond accordingly. So a very different kind of a substance. A hormone is within the body, pheromones are released out of the body, and they're used to communicate with other individuals of your species. So hormones, like we said, these are things produced by glands. They're going to go into the blood. That's kind of one of the biggest things that sets them apart from paracrine or gap junctions or even pheromones, is that these substances go into the bloodstream and they're going to find their target cells from there. Typically, we're talking about some distance from where they're released. So if you're dealing with, if we're dealing with ADH, antidiuretic hormone, released from the posterior pituitary, that's going to have huge effects throughout the body, but one of the places where ADH is going to have an effect would be in the kidneys, where kidneys are then able to recycle more water and help maintain blood volume when somebody might start to move down the road of becoming dehydrated. The endocrine system is made up of all the organs and tissues that help produce hormones and release them out into the blood. Again, can't emphasize this enough. Only cells that have receptors are able to respond to these hormones. So even though these chemicals are going into the blood and they might encounter tons and tons of different cells and tissues and organs, only cells and tissues that have the right receptors are able to detect and respond to those particular hormones. Neurotransmitters can also act as a hormone. So neurotransmitters, not quite exactly the same thing as a hormone, but they have kind of the same effect. We can look at, for example, norepinephrine, which we talked about a little bit in the last chapter. We're dealing with the sympathetic nervous system and norepinephrine, which can help an individual deal with acute stressful situations where you've got some sort of fight or flight situation. Norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter that's released into the blood that serves as a hormone. It has the same effect as a hormone and helps elicit that fight or flight response in that individual. Neurohormones, like I mentioned ADH a second ago, these are produced by neurons, but they're functioning as neurons. So ADH, for example, is produced by the posterior pituitary. It's produced by the hypothalamus. It's released by the posterior pituitary. So that's something we're going to get into a bit more, the anterior versus posterior pituitary. One of them makes its own hormones. The other one doesn't. The posterior is the one that doesn't make its own hormones. The posterior is going to release hormones produced by the hypothalamus, which is part of the brain. And since it's part of the brain, the neurons in the hypothalamus producing this ADH hormone would be producing then a neurohormone. Neurons produce neurohormones in this case. The hypothalamus is producing ADH, which then is released by the posterior pituitary in response to lowered blood volume, increased osmolarity, conditions you might think of with dehydration. We talked about synaptic communication back in the previous chapter on the nervous system. We talked about neurotransmitters like acetylcholine. So this is where you've got one cell communicating across a synapse to some other cell, like a motor neuron that's going to then fire a skeletal muscle cell. All right, that would be a neurotransmitter eliciting a response from some other cell on the other side of a synapse. Again, this is relatively short distance communication. We're dealing right across the synapse, relatively short distance space, with these neurotransmitters. And like I said, we talked about acetylcholine, really good example of a synaptic communicator in the body. Relatively short distance communication, but different than like a gap junction we talked about before. All right, so next up we're going to talk about the characteristics of hormones. This picture, by the way, shows you quite a few of the different hormones we're going to talk about in this chapter. This chapter is kind of challenging, if for no other reason than you've got all these different hormones. We have to think about what kinds of effects they have and when they're released and where they're produced. Do they have an antagonist hormone? Is there one that has kind of the opposite effect? So we're going to look at things like ADH. We're going to look at the anterior pituitary, which is sometimes also called the master gland. With the anterior, we've got adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, growth hormones, prolactin, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and melanocyte-stimulating hormone. So those are all ones produced by the anterior pituitary. Posterior is going to release oxytocin, ADH. We've seen oxytocin before. We've talked a little bit about ADH already. Got thyroxine and calcitonin from the thyroid. We'll talk about epinephrine and norepinephrine a little bit. We'll talk about some of the glucocorticoids here in a second as well. Testosterone and also aldosterone. We've seen the pancreas and insulin and glucagon. Again, those are hormones. We've got melatonin produced by the pineal gland. We've got parathyroid glands producing parathyroid hormone. We've got ANH produced by the heart, so atrial natriuretic peptide or atrial natriuretic hormone, either ANH or ANP, depending on which one you want to use. Kidneys producing erythropoietin, all kinds of hormones produced in the digestive tract, which we're not going to see so much in this chapter, but we will pick up when we cover the digestive system here in a few chapters, a few lectures. And then the gonads producing some of the androgens like testosterone and estrogen and progesterone. There's a lot of stuff on that one picture there, and we're going to take a look at most of those different hormones. All right, so again, the endocrine system, these are all of the things that produce hormones. We talked back in our chapter on the basic animal tissues and systems about the term endocrine versus exocrine. Endocrine glands, of course, do not have a duct of any kind, and they release their hormones directly into the blood, whereas exocrine gland cells do have ducts. The gland does have a duct, and those substances are not released into the blood. They're going to be released somewhere else, the surface of the skin, into the mouth, into the digestive tract, those kinds of places. So hormones overall, generally, from a very broad perspective, have to have two main traits. Number one, they have to be complex. They have to be a complex enough molecule that they can induce the right response. They can deliver enough information to their target cells so the target cells know exactly what to do without any guesswork at all. And then secondly, because these things are going into the blood and maybe traveling some distance away from the source, they also have to be stable. Right? So if they start to change or if they break down before they get to their target cells, they're not going to affect the right target cells. They have to be complex, and they also have to be stable. Now, prostaglandins, this is another one of those paracrine things. And remember, we talked about paracrine. These are things that act at a relatively short distance away from their source. Prostaglandins are produced by pretty much every organ in the body. Right? They're a group of fatty acid molecules. They do a lot of things. They can cause smooth muscle contraction. They help affect lung function. They're involved in labor. And probably most importantly for our purposes right now, they are involved in inflammation. So whenever you have some sort of minor or even serious injury, you've got inflammation there. It's red, it's puffy, it's swollen, it hurts. That begins with the production of prostaglandins from the tissue that's been injured by whatever situation caused the injury. The idea of increased blood flow, right? Why do you want to send more blood to the site of the injury? Well, number one, you're sending nutrients there. Right? You're sending red blood cells with oxygen, you're sending nutrients, they're going to help begin the repair process relatively quickly. You're also going to send more platelets there. So if you're losing blood, if you increase blood flow to that site, you're going to have more platelets arriving, which is going to help the blood clot maybe a little bit sooner, as well as various clotting proteins as well, like thrombin, prothrombin, those sorts of things. And then finally, you're also going to have more white blood cells showing up at the site of the injury, which is great because you might have the possibility of infection. If you've got a cut, a wound of some kind, you may have pathogens introduced into the wound. It's probably not a bad idea to have some white blood cells show up and fight off any invaders that might be present in that wound. This inflammation response is also painful, so one of the ways we can block this is by the use of what are called NSAIDs. You may have heard the term NSAID before, even on TV or on the internet. NSAID stands for non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. So as opposed to something like a hydrocortisone shot, and this is more of an over-the-counter thing like aspirin, ibuprofen, both of those substances have the property of reducing the inflammation response and therefore taking away some of the pain associated with the wound. With that being said, there are times where you may not want to do that. Even though it's uncomfortable, there are times when having the inflammation response is beneficial. After all, the body is not stupid. It's been shaped by a long history of evolution to do things to take care of itself. Even though it may be uncomfortable for a while, the inflammatory response it's there for a reason. And as long as it's not too severe, as long as it's not life-threatening, there actually can be occasions when taking NSAIDs or any type of anti-inflammatory drug could actually be counterproductive. Other types of paracrine things, there are growth factors, which are involved in increasing cell division, actually cause cells to begin to undertake the cell division process sooner and more frequently. There is one called epidermal growth factor. For example, dogs actually have this in their saliva. You think about a dog, if it has a wound on its leg or something, or its side, what does it do? It licks it, right? It's licking the wound. Now, initially you might think, well, maybe it's just soothing itself. Maybe it hurts, so they're taking care of it so it doesn't hurt as much. Well, probably that's true as well. But on a more, long-term basis, by licking the wound, the animal is actually introducing more epidermal growth factor into the wound, which will cause skin cells to divide faster and allow them to begin to repair the injury maybe a little bit sooner. So it's actually beneficial in a lot of ways. Faster repair, probably feels better. Dog doesn't know that, but again, they've been shaped by evolution as well. So for them to take care of a wound in that way, it must be beneficial to them as it pertains to long-term survival and fitness. We see nerve growth factor. This can be involved, especially during development. Neurons that are there, motor neurons especially, that are there during development, some of them have to be thinned out before you're born. The development process actually involves a culling of neurons that some of them, if they're exposed to nerve growth factor, are actually able to survive. Others that aren't exposed to it don't survive. And so that's a way for the body to kind of pick and choose which neurons will be around after an individual is born. Insulin-like growth factor, really important for bone growth. We'll see that a bit more as well. It involves metabolism, also involves cell division. And then cytokines, which are involved in the immune system cell division and also differentiation. When it comes time for basically immune stem cells to choose what kinds of actual immune cells are going to become, cytokines are involved in that process as well. Nitric oxide is also a neurotransmitter. Nitric oxide it's involved in vasodilation. So when it's released into body tissues, it actually causes smooth muscle in the arteries and arterioles to relax, which thereby causes them to dilate, which allows blood to flow more easily through the arteries and arterioles. So blood pressure actually goes down as nitric oxide is reduced. We can also talk about endothelin and bradykinin, which are things which can these actually are two antagonistic paracrine substances. Endothelin is going to allow a drop in blood pressure, whereas bradykinin is going to allow an increase in blood pressure. So all of these substances together are involved with regulating the body, regulating responses of the body. They're involved in growth and development, these kinds of things. They kind of go along with the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system when it comes to controlling what's happening in the body. All right, so we're going to stop here, and I will pick up with a second section here shortly.